The crisp air of February settled over Asheville, North Carolina, a tranquil town nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. For years, Matthew Carter's life had mirrored the serenity of the town. A respected businessman in his late 40s, Matthew was known for his unwavering determination, a trait that had built his thriving real estate empire. Yet, the walls of his carefully constructed life were beginning to tremble. Matthew sat at the dining table, the glow of the overhead light casting sharp shadows on his gaunt face. The diagnosis had come weeks ago: stage 4 cancer. It wasn't just a death sentence, it was a cruel thief, stealing his strength, his independence, and now, perhaps, his sanity. His wife, Sophia, was usually a steady presence in moments of crisis. Her laughter, once the anchor of their home, now felt like a distant echo in the chambers of Matthew's mind. But Sophia's laughter was not entirely gone, it had merely found a new home. Matthew first noticed the change during the quiet hours of the evening, when the hum of the house lulled him into a haze of thought. Sophia's phone seemed to be her lifeline lately. Late at night, she would sit in the living room, her back to the stairs, her voice a hushed whisper. "It's just work," she had said when Matthew asked. But the tilt of her smile, just enough to feel forced, made his stomach churn. "Work," he muttered to himself one night, the word clinging to the bitter taste in his mouth. He could feel the weight of her absence more acutely with every passing day. Their conversations had grown shallow, drained of the warmth and intimacy they once shared. Matthew's body, once strong and capable, betrayed him now with each unsteady step. The physical weakness was one thing, the emotional erosion was unbearable. One evening, the tension boiled over. The sound of Sophia's muffled laughter seeped through the cracks of the house. The cadence of her voice was soft, playful, intoxicatingly familiar, yet utterly foreign. Matthew couldn't resist the magnetic pull of curiosity. He crept down the stairs, his breaths shallow, his footsteps careful on the hardwood floors. From the edge of the staircase, he could see her, sitting cross-legged on the couch, her phone pressed to her ear. The light from the screen illuminated her face, a face alight with joy he hadn't seen in months. For a brief moment, he stood there, transfixed by the image of the woman he loved, glowing in a way that was heartbreakingly unfamiliar. The joy on her face sliced through him, leaving a wound far deeper than cancer ever could. That night, sleep evaded him entirely. Instead, he lay awake, the silence of the house deafening, as a question gnawed at his insides: who was she talking to? The next morning, Matthew confronted her. He chose his words carefully, masking his vulnerability behind a steady tone. "Sophia, I've noticed you've been distant lately," he began, his voice barely masking the tremor of his emotions. Sophia, startled by his directness, paused mid-sip of her coffee. Her eyes darted to the side, her fingers tightening around the mug. "It's nothing, Matthew," she said, her voice tinged with annoyance. "I'm just overwhelmed, with your illness, the house, work, everything." "Is it just work?" Matthew pressed, his eyes boring into hers. "Because it feels like something else." For a moment, her expression cracked. Guilt flashed across her face like lightning, quick and fleeting. Then, she recovered, her lips curling into a soft, practiced smile. "You're being paranoid," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "You have enough on your plate without worrying about things that aren't there." But they were there. Matthew could feel it. Later that day, as Matthew sat in his office, trying to distract himself with paperwork, the question refused to leave him. Every memory of Sophia's late-night phone calls, her guarded expressions, and her sudden shifts in mood played on a loop in his mind. His instincts, honed over decades of making high-stakes decisions in business, screamed at him: something was wrong. That evening, fate intervened. As Sophia left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter, Matthew hesitated. The lock screen lit up with a notification, a text message from D.H. He didn't need to open the message to know who it was. His stomach churned, bile rising in his throat. His fingers hovered over the phone, trembling as the reality of his next action settled on him. When he finally swiped to unlock it, the flood of messages confirmed his worst fear. "Can't wait to see you again. I miss you so much, Sophia." Every word felt like a dagger plunging deeper into his chest. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, clutching the phone as if it were the source of all his pain. The betrayal was no longer a shadow lurking in his mind, it was a vivid, undeniable truth. And as he sat there, the bitter taste of rage creeping into his mouth, Matthew Carter made a silent vow: this will not end here. The days following Matthew's discovery of the texts were a haze of disbelief and bitterness. The words he had read replayed in his mind endlessly, each message between Sophia and David Harris cutting deeper than the last. "Can't wait to see you again. I miss you so much." These weren't the words of a casual conversation, they were confessions of something intimate, something that had no place in his marriage. For over 2 decades, Matthew had trusted Sophia without question. Now, that trust had been shattered, and in its place, a storm of doubt and anger raged. Every glance Sophia gave him felt like a lie. Every moment she spent on her phone or out of the house was like salt in the wound. And David Harris, the man Matthew had once called a brother, was now the source of his deepest betrayal. Late one evening, Matthew found himself sitting in the dim light of his home office, the phone still clutched in his hand. His mind raced with questions that refused to be silenced. How long has this been going on? Did it start after my diagnosis, or before? Was every moment with her a lie? His fingers hovered over the screen. He debated whether to confront her immediately or dig deeper. The thought of confrontation terrified him. He wasn't ready to face the storm head-on. Instead, Matthew began scrolling through Sophia's phone with a trembling hand. The texts weren't just fleeting exchanges, they were laced with affection and a level of intimacy that had once belonged only to him. "I wish you were here with me tonight. Thinking about our time at the cabin. The way you held me. I'll never forget it." Matthew's heart stopped. The cabin. Our cabin. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Sophia and David had tainted a sacred place, one that had once been the setting of their happiest memories. The place where they had celebrated anniversaries, shared laughter with their children, and promised each other forever. Now it was a place of betrayal. Rage boiled within him, threatening to consume the sorrow that had gripped him since the diagnosis. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to steady his breathing. Confrontation felt inevitable, but he knew he couldn't approach her yet, not until he had more answers. The next morning, Matthew decided to act. Sophia was in the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared breakfast. The light streaming through the window gave her an almost angelic glow, but Matthew couldn't reconcile that image with the woman whose words had gutted him just hours earlier. "Sophia," he began, his voice even but strained. "I need to ask you something." She turned, startled by the gravity in his tone. "What is it?" "I've noticed, you've been distant lately," he said carefully, his eyes searching hers. "You're always on your phone. You've been going out late. And last night," he paused, his throat tightening. "Last night, I heard you laughing. You haven't laughed like that in months, not with me." Sophia blinked, her expression guarded. "Matthew, I told you, I'm stressed. Between your diagnosis and everything else, I need some space." "Space?" Matthew repeated, his voice growing sharper. "Or is there something else? Someone else?" Her face paled, and for a fleeting moment, guilt flashed in her eyes. But just as quickly, she masked it with indignation. "I can't believe you're accusing me of something like that," she said, her voice rising. "After everything we've been through, you think I'd do that to you?" "Then tell me the truth," Matthew pressed, his voice trembling with equal parts desperation and anger. "Why the secrecy? Why the late-night phone calls? Who are you talking to, Sophia? Her gaze darted away, and her hands fidgeted with the edge of the counter. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence between them stretching unbearably. Finally, she sighed, her voice softer now. I've just been trying to cope, Matthew. Everything feels like it's falling apart, and I don't know how to handle it. But Matthew wasn't convinced. Her evasion, her refusal to meet his eyes, it all felt like confirmation of his worst fears. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Sophia avoided him, retreating into the sanctuary of their bedroom, while Matthew sat alone in his office, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced with possibilities. He knew he needed proof, something irrefutable that would leave her no room for denial. That evening, fate intervened again. As Matthew was tidying up the living room, Sophia's phone vibrated on the coffee table. She had left it behind in her haste to escape their earlier conversation. The screen lit up with another message from D.H. Matthew's heart pounded as he picked up the phone. This time, there was no hesitation. He unlocked it and began scrolling through the messages. Tomorrow night, same place. I can't stop thinking about you. Me too. I'll make an excuse to get away. Matthew's vision blurred as the weight of those words settled on him. He read further, finding explicit exchanges and plans to meet at a hotel in Charlotte, David City. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Every word on the screen was a dagger plunging deeper into his chest. The room spun around him as he stumbled back, clutching the phone like it was a weapon. He had all the proof he needed now. Sophia's betrayal wasn't just a suspicion, it was a fact. As Matthew sat in the silence of the living room, his breathing ragged, a single thought crystallized in his mind: this isn't over. It won't end like this. The following morning, Matthew sat at the dining table, the phone clutched tightly in his hand. The messages he had read the night before were now burned into his memory, each word a searing reminder of the betrayal that had infiltrated his marriage. Across from him, Sophia poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she sensed the tension hanging heavy in the air. "Sit down, Sophia," Matthew said, his voice low but firm. He didn't wait for her response, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her pause. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair, the steaming mug cradled in her hands like a shield. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone feigning innocence, though her eyes betrayed her unease. Matthew placed the phone on the table between them, the screen still illuminated with the damning messages. "You tell me," he said, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "How long has this been going on?" Sophia's face paled, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone, but Matthew was quicker. He snatched it back, his grip tightening around the device. "No more lies, Sophia. I know about him." For a moment, her composure faltered, the weight of her guilt pressing visibly on her shoulders. But then, to Matthew's surprise, she straightened, her jaw tightening as if she'd made a decision. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp. "You want the truth? You'll get it." The words spilled out like a confession she had been rehearsing for years. "It started months ago," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "At first, it was just conversations. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't consumed by illness." She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Matthew, but he remained silent, his expression stone-like. "David, he was there for me," Sophia continued. "He listened when I felt like I couldn't breathe in this house anymore. And yes, it turned into something more, but," her voice broke slightly, though she quickly recovered. "It's not what you think. This isn't just some meaningless affair." Matthew scoffed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Oh, really? Then what is it, Sophia? Enlighten me." Her next words cut deeper than Matthew could have imagined. I loved him, Matthew. I loved him long before I ever loved you. The room seemed to tilt as Matthew absorbed her confession. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice cracking. Sophia's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug. David and we were together before I met you, she admitted. It wasn't serious, or at least I didn't think it was. Then you came along, and everything changed. You had ambition, stability. You could give me the life I thought I wanted. So I chose you. Matthew felt the air leave his lungs. The woman he had spent 20 years building a life with had been carrying a secret he had never suspected. You chose me, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell does that mean? Was I just some backup plan? Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to look away. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought we could be happy, and for a long time, we were. But then, when you got sick, you changed. You shut me out, Matthew. You became obsessed with controlling everything, my time, my feelings, even how I dealt with your illness. Her words stung, but Matthew couldn't deny their truth. He had changed after the diagnosis, clinging to routines and responsibilities as a way to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But that didn't justify what she had done. So that's your excuse, he snapped. You couldn't handle me being sick, so you went running back to him? It wasn't like that, Sophia said, her voice rising. You weren't there for me either, Matthew. You were so focused on what you were losing that you didn't see what I needed. David, he reminded me of who I was before all of this. Matthew slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. Don't you dare blame me for this, he growled. I've been fighting for my life, and you've been sneaking around with my best friend? The word best friend felt venomous on his tongue now, a reminder of yet another betrayal. And him, Matthew continued, his anger swelling. How long has he been lying to me? Pretending to be my friend while stabbing me in the back. Sophia flinched but didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. Matthew leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. Do you even hear yourself? He asked, his voice quieter now but no less biting. You're justifying this thing you have with him like it's noble. Like it's some tragic love story. But it's not, Sophia. It's a betrayal, pure and simple. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, Sophia stood, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm sorry, Matthew, she said, her voice trembling. But you wanted the truth, and now you have it. She turned and walked away, leaving Matthew alone with his thoughts. The kitchen felt colder without her, the mug of coffee abandoned on the table, its warmth fading. As the door clicked shut behind her, Matthew sat motionless, his mind racing. The woman he had devoted his life to had not only betrayed him but had been carrying a love for another man all along. The betrayal wasn't just an affair. It was the unraveling of 2 decades of lies, a revelation that left Matthew staring into the abyss of his marriage and questioning everything he had ever believed. But as his anger simmered beneath the surface, a new resolve began to take shape. If Sophia thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was gravely mistaken. The silence in the house was deafening. For the first time in 20 years, Matthew Carter felt like a stranger in his own home. The revelation of Sophia's past with David had hollowed him out, leaving behind a cavernous void where love and trust had once resided. He spent hours sitting in his office, staring at the walls lined with awards and accolades, reminders of the life he had built, only to watch it crumble beneath the weight of betrayal. But as the days turned into nights and the nights dragged into weeks, the emptiness began to fill with something darker. At first, it was a slow simmer of anger, a quiet resentment that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. But soon, the anger grew, morphing into a relentless fire that consumed him entirely. Matthew Carter, once a man of reason and patience, was gone. In his place stood a man determined to reclaim what little dignity he had left, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. Matthew's transformation wasn't immediate. For days, he wrestled with his emotions, torn between confronting Sophia and letting the betrayal fester in silence. But the more he replayed her words, the clearer his path became. Forgiveness wasn't an option. Neither was passive acceptance. No, this required something far more deliberate, a reckoning. It began with small acts of observation. Matthew started watching Sophia closely, noting every detail of her behavior. The way she lingered on her phone during quiet moments, the subtle hesitations in her speech when he asked about her day, and, most damningly, the soft, wistful expression that crossed her face when she thought he wasn't looking. All of it fed the growing monster inside him. The turning point came one evening when Sophia received a call from David. Matthew didn't need to see the caller ID to know it was him. He could tell by the way her voice softened, her laughter rising like a melody he hadn't heard in years. She disappeared into the bedroom to take the call, closing the door behind her. That was when Matthew made his decision. It was time to act. The first step in Matthew's plan was to confirm every detail of their affair. He needed more than just the texts he had found, he needed proof that would leave no room for denial. So, he reached out to a private investigator he had once hired for a business dispute. "I need you to follow my wife," Matthew said over the phone, his voice cold and steady. "Her name is Sophia Carter. She's having an affair with a man named David Harris. I want everything: times, places, photos. No detail is too small." The investigator, a gruff man named Paul, didn't ask questions. He simply agreed, his professionalism a stark contrast to the chaos brewing inside Matthew. Within days, Paul delivered results. Photos of Sophia meeting David at a small cafe on the outskirts of Charlotte. Receipts from a hotel where they had stayed overnight. Even a record of phone calls and messages exchanged between them. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Matthew's marriage, and fuel for his growing rage. With the evidence in hand, Matthew moved to the next phase of his plan, playing the role of the devoted husband. He knew that to execute his revenge, he needed to keep Sophia close, unsuspecting. So, he buried his anger beneath a mask of calm. One morning, he suggested a romantic dinner at a local restaurant in Asheville, a place they had often visited in their early years together. Sophia hesitated at first, clearly caught off guard by his sudden warmth, but eventually, she agreed. That evening, Matthew poured on the charm, reminiscing about their shared past and showering her with compliments. He watched as her defenses lowered, a flicker of guilt crossing her face as she allowed herself to be lulled into the illusion of reconciliation. "This feels nice," Sophia admitted, her voice tinged with hesitation. "It's been a while since we've done something like this." Matthew smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "It's never too late to start again," he replied, the lie rolling off his tongue with ease. The dinner was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Matthew orchestrated a series of moments designed to rebuild the facade of their marriage. He suggested a weekend getaway to their cabin by the lake, a place steeped in memories of happier times. Sophia, perhaps out of guilt or a desperate hope to salvage what was left, agreed. As they drove to the cabin, the tension between them was palpable. Matthew kept the conversation light, steering it toward nostalgic anecdotes that painted their past in golden hues. But beneath his calm exterior, his mind churned with plans. The cabin wasn't just a destination, it was the stage for his ultimate act of revenge. Matthew didn't stop with Sophia. He knew that the affair had thrived because of David's confidence, his belief that Matthew was too sick, too weak to fight back. So, Matthew began sowing seeds of doubt. During one of his carefully orchestrated dinners with Sophia, he casually mentioned, "You know, David always struck me as charming, almost too much so. Have you ever wondered if he's like that with everyone?" Sophia froze, her fork hovering mid-air. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "Oh, nothing," Matthew replied with a nonchalant shrug. "Just. I've heard things. Rumors, you know. About how he's not always faithful." The subtle jab hit its mark. Matthew watched as Sophia's brow furrowed, her gaze shifting away in contemplation. It was a small crack, but it was enough to widen the rift between her and David. With each passing day, Matthew's manipulations grew more precise, more calculated. He was no longer the passive victim of their betrayal. He had become the architect of their downfall, the puppeteer pulling the strings of their unraveling relationship. But as the plan neared its climax, Matthew felt a strange sense of satisfaction growing within him. The rage that had consumed him was now tempered by the thrill of control. He wasn't just seeking revenge, he was reclaiming his power, piece by piece. And as the weekend at the cabin loomed closer, Matthew knew one thing with absolute certainty: the storm he was about to unleash would leave none of them untouched. The cabin by Lake Lure stood as a quiet sentinel, nestled amidst towering pines and the glistening waters that reflected the late spring sun. For Matthew Carter, it was no longer a sanctuary of cherished memories. It had become a chessboard where every move he made would push Sophia and David closer to their eventual downfall. As they unpacked their belongings in the rustic cabin, Matthew kept his mask of calm firmly in place. He smiled, laughed, and reminisced, creating the perfect illusion of a man trying to reconnect with his wife. Sophia, hesitant at first, slowly began to lower her guard. But while Matthew was outwardly playing the role of the forgiving husband, his eyes never stopped watching her, calculating every word, every glance, every pause. It began subtly, with small comments that Sophia couldn't immediately pinpoint as manipulative. Over dinner, while the warm glow of the fireplace filled the room, Matthew casually brought up David. "You know," he said, swirling his glass of wine, "I was thinking about David the other day. He's always been quite the charmer, hasn't he?" Sophia froze for a moment, her fork hovering mid-air. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "Oh, nothing really," Matthew replied with a shrug, as if it were a passing thought. "It's just, he's always had a way of making people feel special. A little too special sometimes, don't you think?" Sophia's brow furrowed, her gaze dropping to her plate. "I don't know what you're implying," she said quietly, her voice betraying a hint of defensiveness. "I'm not implying anything," Matthew said smoothly, the corners of his lips curling into a faint smile. I remember hearing some things back in Charlotte. Rumors about him and a woman he worked with. Of course, I never believed them, but you know how people talk." The comment lingered in the air long after the conversation shifted to other topics. Later that night, as Sophia lay awake in bed, her thoughts churned with unease. She told herself that Matthew was simply trying to sow discord, but the seed had been planted. She began to replay her interactions with David in her mind, questioning his intentions, dissecting every compliment, every touch, every promise. The following morning, Sophia found herself sitting by the lake, the soft ripples of water providing a temporary solace from the storm brewing inside her. She clutched her phone tightly, scrolling through old messages from David. "I'll always be here for you. You're the only one who truly understands me. We deserve to be happy." The words had once felt like a lifeline, pulling her out of the despair that had engulfed her after Matthew's diagnosis. But now, in the stillness of the lake, they felt hollow, almost rehearsed. Was David truly committed to her, or had she been a convenient escape for him, just as he had been for her? Her grip on the phone tightened as she opened their most recent conversation. "David, can't wait to see you again. The cabin sounds perfect." "Sophia, me too. We need this." The message now filled her with dread. She thought back to the times David had cancelled plans last minute, the vague excuses about work, the way he sometimes seemed distracted even when they were together. A new thought began to take root in her mind: what if Matthew was right? As the weekend progressed, Matthew continued to play his role with surgical precision. He suggested fishing trips, cozy fireside chats, and long walks along the lake, all designed to make Sophia feel safe and nostalgic. But his sharp eyes noticed the growing tension in her demeanor. She was distracted, her laughter less frequent, her responses more guarded. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sophia finally broke the silence. "Matthew," she began, her voice hesitant. Do you really think David is the kind of man who would?" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Matthew turned to her, his expression carefully neutral. "What do you mean?" Sophia sighed, wringing her hands in her lap. "I don't know. It's just, the things you said about him. The rumors. Do you really think he's unfaithful?" Matthew held her gaze, his silence stretching just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then he spoke, his voice soft but deliberate. "I don't want to believe it. But people aren't always who we think they are, Sophia. Sometimes they tell us what we want to hear because it's convenient for them." His word struck a nerve. Sophia looked away, her thoughts swirling with doubt. She had trusted David implicitly, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been blind to certain truths. If he could betray Matthew, his closest friend, what was stopping him from betraying her? That night, Sophia hesitated before responding to David's texts. Her usual excitement at hearing from him had been replaced by a nagging sense of unease. When he called, she let it ring twice before answering, her voice subdued. "Is everything okay?" David asked, his tone light but probing. "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "Just tired." But David wasn't convinced. "You sound distant. What's going on?" Sophia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Nothing. It's just, this weekend has been a lot. Matthew and I have been talking." David's pause on the other end of the line was barely perceptible, but Sophia felt it. "Talking about what?" he asked, his voice suddenly cautious. "About you," she said softly. The words hung in the air, and for the first time since their affair began, Sophia sensed a crack in David's confidence. It was fleeting, but it was enough to deepen her doubts. From the shadows of the cabin, Matthew watched as Sophia sat alone by the fireplace, her shoulders hunched, her phone held limply in her hand. He didn't need to hear the conversation to know that his plan was working. The guilt and doubt he had planted were now growing like weeds, strangling the trust between her and David. A dark satisfaction settled over Matthew as he turned away, his mind racing with the next steps. The cracks in their affair were widening, and soon, he would exploit them fully. The stage was set, and the players were unraveling exactly as he had planned. The morning of the confrontation arrived with an unsettling stillness. The sun rose over Lake Lure, casting long shadows across the cabin. Inside, Matthew Carter stood at the kitchen counter, his eyes fixed on the scene outside the window. His mind churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The time had come to set his plan into motion. Sophia moved quietly around the cabin, her demeanor unusually reserved. The cracks Matthew had so carefully planted in her resolve were beginning to show. She barely glanced at him as she prepared breakfast, her phone lying untouched on the counter, a sight that filled Matthew with a grim satisfaction. David Harris was on his way. The stage was set. The sound of gravel crunching beneath tires signaled David's arrival. Matthew's chest tightened as he watched the car pull into the driveway. David stepped out, exuding the same easy confidence that had once made him so trustworthy in Matthew's eyes. But now, that charm felt hollow, a veneer covering the betrayal underneath. Sophia greeted David at the door, her smile strained. "Hi," she said softly, glancing nervously at Matthew, who stood a few steps behind her. "Matthew," David said, extending his hand as if nothing had changed. "Good to see you." Matthew hesitated, then shook his hand with a grip firmer than necessary. "David," he replied, his voice cool. "Glad you could join us." The three of them settled into the living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Small talk about the weather and the lake felt excruciatingly hollow. Matthew let them dance around the inevitable, knowing that each passing second brought them closer to the breaking point. Finally, Matthew leaned forward, placing his drink on the coffee table with deliberate force. The sound echoed in the quiet room, drawing their attention. His eyes locked on David, then shifted to Sophia. "There's something we need to talk about," he said, his tone steady but laden with weight. Sophia's eyes widened, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "Matthew," she began, but he raised a hand to silence her. "No more lies, Sophia," he said, his voice sharper now. He turned to David, his gaze piercing. "And no more pretending, David." "I know." David froze, his confident facade faltering for the first time. "Know what?" he asked cautiously, though his voice betrayed him. Matthew stood and retrieved a folder from a nearby cabinet. He dropped it onto the coffee table, the papers spilling out in plain view, photographs, receipts, and printouts of messages. The evidence was irrefutable. "I know about the two of you," Matthew said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. "The late-night calls, the hotel rooms, the lies. I know everything." Sophia's face drained of color as she stared at the damning evidence. "Matthew, please," she stammered, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think." "Don't insult me by lying again," Matthew snapped, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. He turned to David, his eyes blazing. "How long, David? How long have you been stabbing me in the back?" David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. Sophia, desperate to salvage the situation, turned to David. "Say something," she pleaded. Tell him it wasn't just, this isn't what he thinks." But David remained seated, his expression hardening. "What do you want me to say, Sophia?" he asked, his tone cold. "That it was more than it was? That I was going to throw away everything for you? Because I wasn't." Sophia recoiled as if she had been struck. "What are you talking about?" she whispered. "You said." "I said what you wanted to hear," David interrupted, his voice growing harsher. "You needed someone to lean on, and I went along with it. But don't act like this was some great love story, Sophia. It wasn't." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Matthew watched as Sophia crumbled, her hands trembling as she covered her face. A dark satisfaction bloomed within him, though it was laced with the bitter taste of pity. Matthew stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice low but seething. "Both of you. I trusted you. I loved you." Sophia looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake, Matthew. I was weak. But I never stopped loving you." "Stop," Matthew said sharply, cutting her off. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to use love as an excuse." He turned to David, his voice rising. "And you sat across from me at dinners. You held my kids, stood by me when I was fighting for my life, and the whole time, you were waiting for your chance to destroy me." David stood now, his own anger surfacing. "You think you're so perfect, Matthew? You've spent your whole life controlling everyone around you. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to Sophia, this wouldn't have happened." The words ignited a fury in Matthew he could no longer contain. He lunged at David, shoving him back against the wall. The two men grappled, their movements clumsy and fueled by rage. Sophia screamed, rushing to pull them apart, but the chaos was uncontrollable. In the struggle, Matthew's hand found a heavy glass paperweight on the nearby table. Blind with anger, he swung it at David, the impact sending him crashing to the ground. Blood pooled beneath his head, and the room fell eerily silent. Sophia knelt beside David, her cries piercing the stillness. "Matthew, what have you done?" she sobbed, her hands shaking as she tried to rouse him. Matthew stood over them, his breathing ragged, the paperweight still clutched in his hand. His rage began to ebb, replaced by the cold realization of what he had done. Sophia turned to Matthew, her tear-streaked face contorted with grief. You've destroyed everything." Matthew dropped the paperweight, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing in the cabin. "No, Sophia," he said, his voice hollow. "You destroyed everything." As he stood there, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, the serene beauty of the cabin felt like a cruel mockery. The place that had once symbolized love and family was now a stage for betrayal and bloodshed. And for Matthew, there was no going back. The cabin, once a sanctuary of cherished memories, now bore the weight of silence broken only by the sound of Sophia's muffled sobs. The warm, golden light of the setting sun poured through the windows, casting long shadows over the blood-stained floor where David Harris lay motionless. The serene beauty of Lake Lure outside seemed a cruel contrast to the devastation inside. Matthew Carter stood frozen, the heavy paperweight still on the ground where it had fallen from his trembling hand. His chest heaved as he tried to steady his breath, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a crushing tide. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. Or had he? The line between anger and intent had blurred so thoroughly in those moments of rage that he could no longer tell. Sophia knelt beside David, her hands pressed against his chest as though willing him to breathe. Tears streamed down her face, her sobs filling the cabin with a raw grief that Matthew hadn't thought she was capable of. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, wake up. Please." Matthew felt a pang of something. Was it guilt? Regret? He wasn't sure. But it was quickly overshadowed by the cold anger that had fueled him all this time. "Don't cry for him," he said, his voice hoarse. "He wasn't worth it. He betrayed me. He betrayed you." Sophia turned to him, her tear-streaked face contorted with fury. "You think this makes you better than him?" she screamed, her voice shaking. "You think killing him fixes anything? You've destroyed everything, Matthew. Everything." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, leaning against the wall for support as the full weight of her accusation settled over him. He had wanted to expose their betrayal, to make them pay for the pain they had caused him. But now, standing in the wreckage of what had once been his life, he realized that he had gone too far. As Sophia's cries softened into quiet sobs, Matthew slid down the wall, his legs giving out beneath him. His body, already weakened by cancer, now felt as though it had been hollowed out completely. He buried his face in his hands, the enormity of what he had done washing over him in waves. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin was silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside and the sound of their ragged breathing. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "You didn't just kill him, Matthew," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You killed any chance we had left. Any chance of forgiveness. Of moving forward. You've taken everything." Matthew looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "There was nothing left to save, Sophia," he replied quietly. "You destroyed it the moment you let him into our lives." Sophia's gaze hardened. "No, Matthew. We destroyed it together." Her words hung in the air, a harsh truth that neither of them could deny. Their marriage had been crumbling long before David entered the picture. The betrayal, the lies, the anger, they were all symptoms of a foundation that had been eroding for years. The distant sound of sirens broke the tense stillness of the cabin. Sophia looked up, her eyes widening in alarm. "You called the police?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew shook his head slowly. "No," he murmured. "But someone must have heard, the commotion. Sophia stared at him, a mix of fear and disbelief on her face. "What are we going to do?" Matthew didn't answer. Instead, he sat there, staring at the door as the sound of the sirens grew louder. In that moment, he realized that this was the end, for both of them. The life they had built together, the love they had once shared, the promises they had made, it was all gone, reduced to ashes by their choices. When the officers arrived, Sophia immediately began sobbing, her words spilling out in a chaotic tangle as she tried to explain what had happened. Matthew, on the other hand, remained silent. He didn't resist as they handcuffed him, his body limp as though all the fight had left him. He didn't care anymore. There was nothing left to fight for. The news of David Harris's death and Matthew Carter's arrest spread quickly through Asheville. The small, close-knit community was rocked by the scandal, the image of the seemingly perfect Carter family now irrevocably tarnished. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, about the darkness that had been lurking behind the walls of the Carter home. Sophia, now alone, faced the daunting task of picking up the pieces of her shattered life. The weight of her guilt was unbearable. She had betrayed her husband, and in doing so, she had set off a chain of events that had led to David's death. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Matthew's face, filled with rage and pain. She saw David's lifeless body on the cabin floor. The memories haunted her, a constant reminder of the choices that had led them all to this point. From his prison cell, Matthew had plenty of time to reflect on the events that had brought him there. The cancer continued its relentless march, sapping his strength day by day. He knew he didn't have long left, but he found a strange sort of peace in his final days. He had been consumed by anger, blinded by betrayal, and in the end, it had cost him everything. But perhaps, in his final moments, he could find some form of redemption. In the letters he wrote to his children, letters he knew they would read long after he was gone, Matthew tried to convey the lessons he had learned too late. He wrote about the dangers of letting anger and resentment take root, about the importance of forgiveness, and about the need for honesty in all relationships. The tragedy of the Carter family served as a stark reminder to those who heard their story. It wasn't just a tale of betrayal and revenge, it was a cautionary tale about the cost of pride, the weight of unspoken grievances, and the devastating consequences of letting wounds fester. In the end, love and trust are fragile things. Once broken, they are nearly impossible to piece back together. And for Matthew and Sophia, the price of betrayal had been far too high. The cabin by Lake Lure stood quiet once more, its walls bearing silent witness to the tragic events that had unfolded within. The bloodstains had been cleaned, but the scars remained, a testament to love gone wrong, trust betrayed, and the catastrophic cost of vengeance. Matthew Carter spent his final days in a state penitentiary, his body weakening as the cancer consumed him. He declined treatment, resigned to the fate he had sealed with his own hands. Each passing day brought him closer to the end, yet his mind remained trapped in the endless replay of that fateful weekend. The rage that had driven him was gone, replaced by a profound emptiness and a flicker of regret. Sophia Carter, now alone, grappled with the consequences of her choices. Her betrayal had cost her not only her lover but also her husband, the father of her children, and the life she had spent 2 decades building. Every corner of their Asheville home carried memories she could no longer bear, echoes of laughter that had once filled the rooms, now replaced by silence. She avoided the cabin entirely. It had become a monument to everything she had lost. Instead, she spent her days trying to salvage a semblance of normalcy for her children, who were old enough to understand but too young to fully process the depth of their family's collapse. The Carter children bore the brunt of the tragedy. Their once stable world had crumbled, leaving them to navigate the fallout with a mix of anger, confusion, and sadness. The whispers in their community, the sideways glances at school, the pitying stares of neighbors, they carried it all, silent witnesses to the destruction wrought by their parents' choices. Despite everything, Matthew's letters to them became a beacon of sorts. His words, raw, unfiltered, and filled with regret, offered glimpses into his mind during his final days. He spoke not of excuses but of lessons learned too late. He urged them to be better than he had been, to forgive more freely, and to never let anger dictate their actions. On quiet evenings, Sophia often found herself drawn to the letters Matthew had left behind. Though they were addressed to their children, she couldn't help but feel they carried messages for her as well. One line, in particular, stayed with her. "Love isn't perfect. It's fragile, messy, and often painful. But it's worth fighting for, so long as you fight with kindness, not cruelty." She would never know if she and Matthew could have repaired what was broken. That chance had been taken from them both, leaving only questions that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The tragedy of the Carter family reverberated through their small Asheville community, a tale retold in hushed whispers and cautious warnings. It wasn't just a story of infidelity or revenge, it was a cautionary tale about what happens when wounds are left to fester, when pride outweighs love, and when forgiveness is seen as weakness rather than strength. But amidst the wreckage, one question lingered: could this have been avoided? Could Matthew and Sophia, despite their flaws and failures, have found a way back to each other? Or was their fate inevitable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode? What do you think? Could Matthew and Sophia have saved their marriage, or was their fate sealed the moment trust was broken? Was Matthew's reaction justified, or did he let his anger destroy what little he had left? Have you ever faced a situation where forgiveness felt impossible? How did you handle it? The story of Matthew and Sophia Carter is not just one of betrayal and vengeance, it is a reflection of the fragile nature of relationships and the devastating cost of unresolved pain. It reminds us all that love, while imperfect, can only survive when nurtured with honesty, communication, and the willingness to forgive. What's your take on their story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of the human heart.